Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. Before we start, I just want to let you know that my first ever full-length fantasy novel titled To Kill a Dragon, now available on Amazon. So if you guys want to go take a look, maybe leave a review. After all, if I'm dishing out, I need to be able to take it. But now on to the matter at hand. Let's talk about the newest album from Neon Indian, titled VEGA International Night School. So remember chillwave? Remember when that was a thing? A trend that seemed to spring partially from the warped edges of gleaming early 80s synthpop and the gummy lo-fi production of Ariel Pink? Remember how it was a big thing in the indie scene for seemingly about a year or two before evaporating in the hot sun for the next big trend? Because I certainly don't. Now part of this is just time and place. I was listening to very different music in and around the latter half of the 2000s, and chillwave was one of those nebulously defined subgenres that completely passed me by. There and gone, and I never really cared. But going back to listen to a lot of it now, I'm a little baffled why there was so much hype for this in the first place. Yeah, the lo-fi eclecticism of the synthpop, nifty trick, but many of the synth textures didn't really stick with me or blend into particularly solid wholes. It wasn't that it was bad, although there was a fair amount of mediocre stuff around the edges of the genre that was just coasting by in the fad, as you run into with any musical trend. But then again, Ariel Pink was already making similar, albeit weirder music and doing it with more cohesion both in the melodies, production, and lyrics. It was simply just better. Now that said, I do give Neon Indian a certain amount of credit for at least trying to bring a loose sense of humor and fun to a genre that often proved oddly humorless. The main project of frontman Alan Palomo, his debut record in 2009 got a lot of critical acclaim and buzz. So much so that it catapulted him into the mainstream festival circuit where he did surprisingly well for being loose, catchy, occasionally fun, and genuinely funny. So it wasn't surprising that the backlash towards chillwave came in force. As that came through, Palomo worked to double down on the bigger, buzzier, thicker sounds, even teaming up with Flaming Lips producer David Friedman to overcompress and add more density to the mix. And yeah, the melodic core in that sophomore record is still there and some of the quirkier elements did creep through, but I was among a lot of people who thought it was a slightly less satisfying effort, even though, if I can be honest, I never really found much chillwave to be all that exhilarating or interesting to begin with. Just not my thing. So when I heard that Palomo was looking to bring in more elements of disco and future funk for his upcoming third album, adapted from his VEGA side project, which has been around almost as long as Neon Indian, I was interested at least, especially considering the critical acclaim started pouring in as you'd expect. So a payoff? Well, that depends. I've given VEGA International Night School a lot of listens, and I completely get it. The atmosphere, the style, the influences, the tone of this album, plunging into the seedy, flamboyantly neon, unabashedly retro early 80s glitzy new wave and synthpop. In other words, right up my alley, at least it should be. But the more I've listened through this album, the more I felt the chillwave textures muddying and sloshing over otherwise solid songs, making songs that are not only not as tight, but less enjoyable. Now that's not saying there aren't some good moments on this album, but that's just it. They're moments that seldom coalesce into satisfying songs and an album as a whole. What could have been a great record is held back to being merely a good one, and I gotta admit that's a little bit disappointing for me. Now I should explain perhaps the best place to start is Alan Palomo himself. And look, for this breed of 80s synthpop and future funk, you don't need a powerhouse frontman. As long as the vocals can fit in the atmosphere and the groove, as long as he's got that level of retro cool to work, or at least self-awareness that it's not really as cool as it seems. And when this album can leverage his tenor with just enough reverb and the right melody behind them, his delivery can work as the lone hardscrabble wanderer in the shadow-crossed garish colors of the city, especially when he dips into his lower range, which I wish he did more of on this album. I'm not nearly as impressed with this falsetto. That's more because the mix often buries it beneath oily waves of synth that are half swallowed up by reverb and half by the gurgling bass lines. Perhaps his voice was given a little bit more room to breathe, it might work a little bit better, but then you have to wonder if it would compromise that claustrophobic, half-heard pseudo-noir vibe across most of this album, that ragged, desperate cool of the gutter in the heart of the city at the very early 80s in that recession period. But there is a difference between cultivating that glossy mystique and air and atmosphere and some clumsy production, which is arguably where my biggest issues with this album arise. See, if you were to go back to much of that early 80s synth pop and funk that inspires this album, you'd hear the gurgling bass lines and the processed reggae grooves in the vein of the Police, and you get gleaming analog synthesizers filled with chiptune and snarled compressed guitars. But the reason why so much of that material worked were the solid melodic grooves and a sense of tightness and restraint. And considering Palomo isn't the sort of frontman who can contain the entire mix with simply his vocal line, except for the couple times I actually introduced multi-tracking, which turns out really well, I should have done more of it, you need to have those melodies and grooves to give them some space to establish themselves. But where a band like Churches cranked up the grooves to razor-type precision, and Lower Dens focused on cultivating the sparse, chilly soundscapes that call back to post-punk, Neon Indian decides to pile on some melodic flourishes and the synthesizers and chiptune fragments and tape spooling and vocal snippets, and none of it highlights the already strong melodic compositions at the bass line. It already leads to tracks that feel cluttered with only more snippets that work, like the dark elastic groove on the outro of Annie that might sound good, or the dark spiky interlude that creeps in before the second chorus of Smut. But again, these are moments. Hell, when this album actually calls back to the darker segments that Palomo pioneered on Era Extrana, he gets some pretty damn solid results, especially in the back half of the sound where he lets tracks like Slumlord Re-lease and Techno Clique and the slower Baby's Eyes get some more breathing room. They're a little bit more minimalist and they really work. Now sure, none of it has the tightness that characterized the best of 80s new wave and funk. Palomo slathers his gurgling bass and warping chiptune and pitch shifting over way too many of these songs to give any of the rubbery, gummy tracks any real sharpness. But in a damp, woozy, atmospheric vibe, it kind of works. I just wish the points like the guitar solo trying to cut through Dear Skorpio magazine, or that great bouncy groove across C'est La Vie that abruptly shifts into this ugly staccato progression that completely kills the mood, or the Bad Boys escarege of 61 Cygni Avenue that feels diminished behind chipmunk vocals and a weedy synth. I wish those good moments were allowed to flourish and get more spotlight room. Sadly, I think it's that chillwave tendency that contributes to many of these choices, which leaves so many of these tracks feeling just overdone and overwrought and a little bit overcooked. So, okay, do the lyrics salvage anything? Well, that depends whether or not you find the late night escapades that Palomo describes all that thrilling or exciting in a retro sort of vein. This is arguably where you find the biggest shift towards more openly sexual lyricism, which I will state does kind of work with this instrumentation. Granted, part of it is because with this type of homegrown lo-fi production, I can easily imagine many of these tracks playing as background and particularly artistic 80s porn. Something that Palomo actually seems to embrace rather gleefully, reveling in the seedy sleaze of Smut or Dear Skorpio magazine, or the trashy veneer that seems to color the B-list cop show vibe of Annie, or the exploitation of the glitzy Hyde, or the overly earnest Slumlord or Street Level. And hell, I like the ending message despite how much he's eager to see the light and see that news, that fleshy, intoxicating night is gonna keep dragging him back on News from the Sun. And look, the lurid subject matter, it doesn't bug me all that much. Hell, get the right moment, I'd argue the melodrama places at just the right level of glorious excess to kind of click for me. Even if there really isn't a natural progression from neon party to neon party outside of our protagonist slowly sinking into that night in his wandering search for this girl. In a way, it feels a bit like the exploitation films of that era in the early 80s, using any excuse to set up steamy encounters to the plot to add the flimsiest justification just to go over the top and glorious excess. But at the same time, it suffers some of the problems of that type of exploitation as well. It's indulgent and meandering, when taking some of the same source material adding some tighter craftsmanship when it made for more satisfying emotional payoff, especially considering this record doesn't hit those instrumental or lyrical climax points as often as it should. I get it's going for more of a dance vibe, but it could have had some better climax moments and driving synth lines and driving grooves, and it doesn't really go in that direction, which I found a bit of a disappointment. So you know what, as a whole, look, there's too much about VEGA International Night School that I'm naturally inclined to like for me not to recommend this. When you actually dig into the melodic interplay, there's a lot to recommend. There's some really great moments, and at its best, the blend of textures and grooves can hit some really satisfying points. But again, the muddying blur of sounds don't always flatter our frontman, his lyrics, or the album as a whole. I'm not sure how much more material Palomo can mine from this era of sound without amping up his production, going a little bit more hi-fi and glossy. So for me, I'm thinking a solid 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, especially if you're more of a chillwave fan than I am. As I said, chillwave isn't really my thing, but if it is, you're gonna love this. Whether you're intending for a run through seedy dive bars or a trashy late night hookup, you got yourself a soundtrack, and a pretty damn good one. Here you go, folks. Have fun at night school. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'll try to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.